For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. For all who exalt themselves will be humble, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. It's one of those classic Jesus sayings, right, from Luke. Even if you didn't know you knew it, probably by the time I got to that part, you knew. You're like, oh yeah, okay, it's that one. It's the one about the exalting and the humbling, the spinning of everything, turning things upside down. And I have to say that growing up, I always thought I had an odd perspective on the place where wealth and poverty intersected with this idea of exaltedness. You see, I went to, it comes as a shock to you, I'm sure, I went to prep school. Y'all know what prep school is, kids? I don't know if people say that anymore. College preparatory school. I went to a private school in Maine. In fact, that school that I went to was older than the state itself. I wore a blazer and a tie and khaki pants and leather shoes every weekday. Now that's what I wear on weekends, obviously. And there were people in that school whose job it was to make sure that I got into and then attended a prestigious college. And no doubt there were other people in the school whose job it was to steer me toward professions that would be satisfying, both on a personal level and a financial level, to the extent that those two levels were different. However, this prep school was also a day school, which is probably also a term that isn't used so much anymore. But it meant that every day, it meant there were no dorms, so it meant that every day after required sports were over, where we would take the field frequently to compete against kids just like us, I would return to the working class town where I grew up, to my dad, a liberal politician and a lawyer for labor unions, and my mom, a public health nurse and instructor at our local community college. So I ended up, like many people do over the course of their lives, living in two slightly different worlds, with one world containing a much higher level of privilege than the other. But one of the interesting things I noticed was that when it came to how people saw rich folks and poor folks, they were quite the same. While my prep school went out of its way to be inclusive and sort of lightly liberal in that Brahmin sort of way we were talking about earlier, the general culture in which it moved and in which I moved when I was there tended to exalt wealth and those who had it, without even really thinking about it. And since many people in that world had money, they congratulated themselves and thought they were pretty important. And while my lefty parents were always on the lookout for hints of elitism in my worldview, the culture of that working class town exalted wealth too. And they punished themselves for their perceived failings. And the same can be said for the private liberal arts college that did accept me as a freshman, and also said for the more economically diverse state university from which I graduated. The acquisition of wealth was exalted, and people without were humbled. And other than my friends in the college chapters of the Democratic Socialists of America, where I hung out, most people seemed more interested in making more money for themselves than in redistributing it. And since those days, this truth, this fact of our secular culture, has always seemed a little strange to me in a nation where so many people claim to be guided by those teachings that we find in the Bible. Now, we're familiar with this dynamic, of course. I mean, a manifestation of it is being discussed by pundits every day on the news as some, but certainly not all, poor and working class voters voted against their self-interest and for people with only a rudimentary understanding of their lives. And we could spend some time unpacking that too. But we're a church. Other people are doing that. So I want to turn this Lenten season instead to our approach, our perspective, our attitude toward the phenomenon of the glorification of wealth. What do we do as people of faith? Now, when most of you saw the title for today's sermon, I imagine that you probably thought of another Bible passage. I certainly hope you did, or else I'm not doing my job. The one from the Beatitudes, right, in Luke, which usually is some variation depending on the translation of, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And maybe some of you even thought of the less political and more otherworldly version in Matthew. "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Both of these are in the Bible, and they, of course, have different meanings that are held somewhat in tension, which means that if you cannot find comfort in one, there is always the other. And there's also always the opportunity to treat the radically inclusive theology expressed in Luke with a kind of pious head nod and maybe a brief pang of conscience on the way back to the office for more material gain. That, of course, is not how we are supposed to look at this statement, even though all of us probably have at some point. You see, deeply embedded in the Gospels, not hidden in the Gospels, but deeply embedded, part of its foundation, is a message of radical equality, one that requires us to act in a certain way, to treat poverty as a sin, and a sin not of the individual who lacks material wealth, but as a corporate sin of the society that lets some have more finite resources at the expense of others who have fewer finite resources. And it requires us to treat this problem of unequal distribution not merely with charity, but with systematic changes in our own behavior and systematic changes in the way we govern ourselves. Now, those of you who have Facebook may be familiar with the memes. I have a lot of Christian activist friends, maybe you don't, but the memes of those people who were involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign, to the effect that it wasn't the first time they found themselves following a Jewish socialist. And while economic socialism, as we know it, came way after Jesus' time, there is a great deal of truth in that statement. When we hear or read lines in Luke, like "Blessed are the poor," or "Sell all that you own and distribute the money," or "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God," we, in the midst of our own materialism, are meant to react not with measured concern, but with abject horror, guilt over our callousness and lack of care. We are meant to be like the tax collector in our reading today. We are meant to be on our knees. "God be merciful to me," he said. "God be merciful to me, a sinner." More often than not, however, as an American culture, we have chosen that other path. To the degree that we are able, that when we are able, we have been encouraged to cultivate a sense of superiority based on class and social standing. We are encouraged, not in church, but in the world outside, to speak like the Pharisee in our reading. "God, I thank you that I am not like other people. I thank you that I am not like other people, like those thieves, rogues, and adulterers. And that language, thieves, rogues, and adulterers, is intentional and had a double meaning back when it was written, just as it does today, because that is how many people see poor people. As criminals, as unsavory characters who require drug tests before we assist them, rather than as human beings in need of our assistance, in need of our support. Perhaps even people who require our apologies for thinking of ourselves before we think of them. Now, obviously, the attitude of that Pharisee is not new. It was true in Jesus' time and before Jesus' time. But it is far from being abolished. It was just as true when Theodore Parker made his observation that the man who is rich enough to be idle values himself in his leisure, and what is worse, he says, others value him for it. Others value him for it. We see that today in our conflation of the words worth and wealth. The idea that one's worth is measured in dollars and cents is so deeply ingrained in us that simple wealth, no matter how it was gained, is viewed as a qualification for leadership, elected or otherwise, as a mystical anointing, just as it was in the time of the divine right of kings. And today we see this attitude floating close to the surface in virtually all our political debates. Healthcare, which I said Donna will talk about next week. Immigration. Discrimination based on gender and race. The role of law enforcement in society. Local zoning. And of course, as my opening story may have implied, access to quality education. All of these and more besides take into account the flow of money. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who will get more? Who will get less? Who in essence has worth? Who is worthy of our society's support? But the narrative we find here in church, that story in our journey of faith, regardless of which prophet or religion one might follow, actually, runs directly counter to the prevailing narrative of our secular society on this point. Here at church, regardless of our personal systematic theology around the life of Jesus, the miracles and the resurrection and things like that, regardless of that, we try to take his teachings seriously. And he is not alone. He is not alone among the prophets of the world's religions. The Family Promise Walk is coming up, as you know, and the institution, the church congregation, I should say, that overwhelmingly beats every other walking group is the mosque, the Islamic Center of Boston, which is really in Wayland. Many of you have been there. And this past Thursday, my wife Allison and I went to a dinner there for Family Promise. And many of the speakers, including Dr. Faisal Khan, the Director of Religious Affairs, talked about the spiritual connection between their Islamic faith and the call to give. And the call to give whatever they are able to give. Which reminded me of these words from the Quran. You shall not attain righteousness. You shall not attain righteousness until you spend out of what you love in the way of God. For God knows what you spend. You shall not attain righteousness until you spend out of what you love. In fact, all the world's faiths, where we as human beings have chosen to deposit the rules of life to which we held ourselves accountable, are very clear on this point. They place us on what today seems to be a radical road, but which, for all its sacrifice and challenges, is a remarkably clear one. So as we continue on our Lenten discipline this year, as we continue to muddle away as humans, we should at least try, even in the midst of our own families. We must try to choose the path of faith, of peace, of equality, and of justice for all. A world where those who exalt themselves are humble, and where the humble learn that they too are worthy and exalted. Amen.